over the past couple of weeks, especially not only here in the UK, but you've seen big protests going on Australia as well, and some very, very extreme stuff going on in America as well. You've only got to think just a couple of months back, I think it was the governor of Michigan. There was a kidnap plot going on to kidnap her because of she was pushing, well, what we can only call basic public safety measures in the face of a pandemic. And what's even worse is that most of these basic public safety measures have been around for decades. And not even just recent history, going all the way back to like Roman times. They knew the importance of, quarantines and, isolating. They may not have known about, germs and viruses, but at least they got the theory, the basic theory down of, if we keep the people isolated for a bit, then eventually the virus will go away and eventually things can return to normal. But unfortunately, there has been a very, very, very alarming, merger, between these anti-vax protesters and a lot of far-right people. For example, in a lot of the far-right protests that have been taking place here in the UK, there has been a very significant presence of essentially the neo-fascist movement here in the UK. And they have been very openly, publicly campaigning against anti-lockdown, joining in with a lot of the anti-vax stuff and even co-opting it to suit their own ends. So we're going to go over this fantastic piece between in the New Statesman, which goes over this and says we have to be aware of this because this is a potential threat, not only politically, but even as like from a public health point of view, this is a potential deadly threat because the far right are agitating these anti-vaxxers into doing violence. Here in the UK, we have seen a number of protests essentially try and get into the old BBC buildings. We've seen them try to get into ITV and even Channel 4 very recently. And currently they've been, shall we say, stuck at the door. But how long before they, shall we say, decide to go further than that? So anyway, before we do jump into this article, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, as well as my one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all the people who do support the channel that way. So this, as we said, comes from the New Statesman, and the title is "The Alliance Between the Anti-Vaxxers and the Far Right is a Deadly Threat." The Nuremberg trials are going ahead on the 1st of September, yelled one anti-vax protester through a megaphone at a BBC crew in Scarborough last week. "The nooses are ready. You will hang for what you've done to this country." In Brighton, protesters picketed a vaccine centre, letting off a smoke bomb and forcing some appointments to be cancelled. This is the new face of the anti-vaxxer movement. People radicalized on social media, completely insured to science and objective reporting on the mainstream media, and increasingly prepared to threaten violence. But that's only the public face. Daily Mail reporters have infiltrated a 200-strong group of military veterans called Veterans for Freedom, whose Telegram conversations revolve around part threat, part fantasy of staging a violent insurrection in which vaccine centers are shut down and their staff harmed. Again, this is incredibly dangerous. Incredibly dangerous. The anti-vax movement has, in short, become a magnet for people engaged in anti-truth and anti-science politics, and an open conduit to the extreme right. So you might think, well, hang on, why are these extreme rightists allying with these people? Because Just as with the anti-vaxxers, the extreme right are very anti-science and anti-facts. So there is a perfect crossover for them. And of course, surveying press photography on the 28th of August demos, there is a clear that it is not just the demographic of the Brexit Party, elderly white conservatives, nor is it the demographic of Extinction Rebellion, the educated, progressive, young and old. It is attracting ex-soldiers, young mothers conned by the idea that their children will be used as guinea pigs, Christian fundamentalists, and habitual addicts of conspiracy theory who follow figures such as Piers Corbyn and David Icke. My impression is at the moment it is attracting a much larger low-income young people than mainstream politics does. They are, in short, what the psychiatrist William Wright called in the 1930s, people in trouble, the raw material of early fascism. And all over the democratic world, both the populist right and the fascist right have latched on to their concerns and begun to mobilize them. So why now? Because with many of the advanced countries having vaccinated nearly about 70% of their adult population, government and corporations are beginning to address the free rider problem. How do you nudge or persuade or ultimately coerce those who are vaccine hesitant or who are prepared to rely on the herd immunity supplied by others? This was less of a problem when health services were still hoovering up a long queue of people who wanted the jab but couldn't get it. Now, with the UK government determined to introduce vaccine passports for nightclubs and indoor venues from October the 1st, some colleges and corporations are already demanding double jab status, and the hardcore politicized anti-vaxxers have seen their chance. The dangers are twofold. First, that activists could exploit the ready-made lie of dissemination machine of social media to create the mass resistance movement to vaccinations, the untold story of the pandemic that has been growing skepticism among young working class people, whose lives have been blighted educationally, economically, and socially by the lockdown. The second danger is political. If we take apart one of the leaflets used on the 28th of August demos published by the White Rose, a group of Catholic fundamentalists, we can see how easily the anti-vaxxer ideology maps onto the thought architecture of the extreme right. And again, being from Yorkshire, how dare you use my county's flag for your propaganda machine? I am very, very insulted by that. Also entitled, End the COVID Fraud and Global Genocide Now. The leaflet, which was pushed through my door in South London, claims the vaccine is killing people. The COVID is just fraud and is causing a global genocide. It claims that the virus is less lethal than the seasonal flu, that the death rates have been falsified to exaggerate the impact of the disease, and the vaccine is experimental and is in fact a gene-modifying injection, causing more adverse reactions and deaths than all other vaccines together. It adds that scientific debate has been suppressed to give voice only to approved agencies, and those beyond the crime are said to include the governments and, of course, the World Economic Forum. These are the numerous points of convergence with the modern fascist thinking. The first is the allegation that genocide is being perpetrated against white Christians. For the dedicated far-right extremists, this is the core of the Great Replacement theory, which claims that immigration to largely white countries combined with the falling white birth rate is a form of genocide. Once you establish it in your mind that the delusion that you are a victim of genocide, then, as in the work of the Great Replacement guru, French writer Renaud claims, the extreme forms of resistance will then follow. Hence the reference to the Nuremberg trials, the hanging in the Scarborough demo. These references are common online. And the new thought architecture of fascism, they are just a justified search for accomplices. Feminists, human rights lawyers, liberals, and Marxists are all seen as collaborators with the occupying power, i.e. migrants. Thinking of the White Rose movement, the exact same logic structure exists as well. The name of the group is borrowed from the Catholic anti-fascist group who resisted the Third Reich. The most famous member was Sophie Scholl, executed by the guillotine in 1943 for handing out anti-Nazi leaflets. The British anti-vaxxers depict themselves as the modern-day equivalents of Scholl. Like the White Rose in Germany that resisted the Nazi regime, we encourage people to resist the COVID tyranny. We do not want any more lockdowns and demand an end to all restrictions. Though they claim to be peaceful, recent street activities have involved intimidation of the media, public death threats, and attempts to physically impede healthcare professionals. By setting themselves up as victims of genocide, the anti-vaxxers have given themselves permission to threaten violence. No matter what route people take into the movement, and no matter how genuine the concerns about state power or big pharma, this is the new self-selected periphery of the far right. Firstly, they were anti-lockdown. Then they said COVID-19 was a hoax. Now they say the vaccine is a genocide plot by the world government. Again, the WF is just a far-right parlance in a polite way of saying Zionist-occupied government. What unites these groups with other parties of the far-right periphery, including the football lads who staged a demo against the Black Lives Matter last summer, or the QAnon and Trump supporters who drift from one public disorder to another, is a propensity for performative self-deception. When we speak of radicalization, we tend to think of it moving along a left-right axis, with people moving ideologically from one position of moderate social critique towards the extremes, whether in Christian fundamentalism, Islamic extremism, or just straightforward Hitler worship. But it is equally important for this journey is the move away from truth. And the sociologist Karl Mannheim, who observed the rise of Nazism firsthand, noticed how the collapse of a passive and progressive ideology of the Protestant German nationalism, and it triggered the rise of a utopian thinking among large numbers of people, both on the far left and far right. Faced with the collapse of social order, large numbers of people embraced irrationalism, mysticism, and a total and absolute distrust of all sources of information. For such people then, as now, the ultimate proof of their build your own truth is that other people share it. Hence the need for public displays of defiance, the COVID hoax t-shirts, the threats against news crews, and the attacks on police. Their self-deception cannot be passive and private. It is only to be actively and publicly maintained through street performances and social media conversations. The far right in Britain remains small but incredibly dangerous. Nearly 1 in 6 terror convicts in the UK jails are now from the far right. And while there are more trials in progress, the populist right, meanwhile, remains absorbed within the Conservative Party. But between the two forces, there is a large, dangerous online world of science skepticism, men's rights activism, and what the Germans called Quadrucken, the refusal to believe any accepted wisdom. Then, when parts of these forms into an underground militia, the fascinating fantasizing, shall we say, about insurrection and other parts take to the streets with threats to hang BBC journalists, you better start worrying, because it is potential audience that anyone because its potential audience is anyone who doesn't want the jab. And again, we have to be incredibly worried about this. This is really worrying. I've noticed it, like I say, a couple of weeks ago, obviously with David Icke, and then I saw the new Union of Fascists, as they go by now, which again is our British Nazis, are in that crowd, actively recruiting people. You've seen here the Christian fundamentalists co-opting a very famous anti Nazi figure to their own movement, because to them they are, quote, fighting against them. But again, when you've got mix all this going on with very, very worrying messages and communications from veterans who are fantasizing about takeover of the government or performing violence against vaccine centers and the people inside, that's a point where we have to start worrying. we really have to start worrying. And if you know anyone who is involved in these types of activities and you think or you suspect that they are taking it too far, then I urge you report them to police, because it potentially could not be long before something bad could happen. Like I say, at the moment, they're still fantasizing about it, but how long before those fantasies turn into reality? And that, of course, really is the deadly question that we have to ask, and something that we must keep an eye on and actively try and fight against. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.